Hi, I'm Flegg from Ethical Property Partners. At EPP, we help committed investors to take their investing to the next level and to build themselves profitable portfolios that they never even dreamed was possible. In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about the Complexity Conundrum. Now, this is an educational concept of ours at EPP that we rely on day in and day out, but it's a very misunderstood concept in the world of property investors. Now, most investors don't even know what the Complexity Conundrum is. I came up with it about 6-7 years ago, but most investors have never even thought of it. Those that have heard of the Complexity Conundrum or have worked it out for themselves don't employ it properly. And so in this episode, I'm going to explain to you what the Complexity Conundrum is and how you can use it in your own SPI business, your own sophisticated property investing business. So what is the Complexity Conundrum? Well, in essence, it's very, very simple. It's a graph. And what it means is as complexity of a deal increases, so at the bog standard, simplest possible deal is where you buy a property below market value from a vendor as quickly and as simply as possible. So let's say it's a £200,000 property and you buy it for £150,000. It doesn't get any simpler than that. You give them 150k, they give you a property that's worth 200. You can buy that property in 4, 5, 6 days. It's very, very simple. You can waive your rights to searches, you can raise no inquiries, and this is if you know what you're doing, and if you tell your solicitors to do this, your solicitors will have a heart attack, but you could actually buy that property very, very quickly. When I say your solicitors will have a heart attack, they won't if they're commercially minded solicitors that know what they're doing, but if they're run-of-the-mill bog standard solicitors, they will possibly even refuse to represent you if you start talking about not doing searches and not raising any inquiries. That's at the simplest level of complexity. And then you can take the complexity of a deal all the way up to the most complex deals. And some of them have 10, 15 moving parts, different agreements. So when I'm doing a deal with one of my franchisees, for example, we will often have an option to buy, an option to lease, a penalty clause in the option. We'll have multiple mechanisms to ensure that how we're structuring the deal on a simple heads of terms, one-page heads of terms, actually holds water legally. Often a 5, 6, 7 point heads of terms on a single side of A4, which is how we do all of our deals, that will often turn into perhaps 4, 5, 6 different legal agreements that we need to write up between ourselves. And so that's like the ultimate level of complexity where there's agreements, counter agreements, etc., etc. But when I'm doing that with one of my franchisees, and I've joint ventured with about 1/3 of my franchisees, believe it or not. I love joint venturing, and if that means they can do more deals, if that means that I get more time leverage, it's a win-win as far as I'm concerned. But because we have such a high level of trust, and because we're both committed to doing the deal, the complexity can be really hard, and we're both going to stick with it. We're not going to get to the point where we go, do you know what, this is too complicated, it's not worth the hassle. And that's the thing, is the deal worth the hassle of doing it? Well, the deals that we do on EPP are so lucrative, they're so positive, they're such good deals that it's worth jumping through a lot of hoops. But that's not always the case. So I'm going to come on to where you shouldn't go for the most complex deal in a few minutes. But why should you go for complex deals? Well, typically, if you're doing a simple deal, if you've got the choice between doing a simple deal and a complex deal, the complex deal will make all parties more money, almost without exception, because you can tailor it to your best situation or tailor it so that it performs best for you. And you can tailor it so it performs best for the vendor. And I'm talking about things like key undertakings. A key undertaking is where you access the property before you own it, you do works to the property. I've done 30, 40, 50,000 pounds worth of works to properties that I don't even own myself on a key undertaking, so the vendor still owns it. Well, that's brilliant, because I haven't had to buy the property, I haven't had to pay stamp duty, I haven't had to finance the property. I just do the works, and then I can buy the property in an increased condition at a higher valuation and get more lending on it. It's a win-win. But as complexity goes up, And generally, the higher the complexity, the better the profitability for me and the vendor. If I can purchase the property and get more lending on it, for example, after doing a key undertaking, I can give the vendor more for the deal. Or sometimes we'll do a let before purchase agreement. So as we're going through conveyancing, we might be able to do 2 months of lettings. I often will give the vendor 50% of the rental income. Well, it's brilliant for me because I'm getting half rent on a property I don't even own yet. So I'm getting an infinite return on that rent. And if it takes a bit longer, it takes 3 months, then brilliant. I've had 3 months of half rent. That's great. It also means on the day of completion, I've got a tenant in situ. There's no refurb to do on my own dime. There's no tenant finding to do. There's no referencing. That's all done in advance. So on the day of completion, I've got a tenanted property that's already been refurbed. The vendor, on the other hand, normally they've got an empty property, especially if it's a second home or if it's a buy-to-let property or if it's a vacant property. They're getting an income on a property that ordinarily would be sat empty, and they'd be wasting that time and just, putting me under more pressure to buy it quickly. If we're both getting an income from it, the pressure's off and we can both do better. So typically, simple deal is not as good for all parties. However, that's not the only 2 parameters to this conundrum. The complexity conundrum actually has a third variable, which is very, very important. And that is that as complexity goes up and profitability goes up for all parties, the percentage chance of the deal completing actually decreases. So simple deal, high probability of it going to completion. Highly complex deal, low probability of the deal actually completing. Which is why I use the example of joint ventures between myself and my franchisees. We've got massively high levels of trust between ourselves. We've done lots of deals. We've shown our true colours. We've walked through challenges together, and we're committed to one another for 5 years. EPP is a 5-year franchise, and so we can do really complex deals because we're both in it to make the most juice from every single deal. But with a vendor who we've never dealt with before, there's less trust. And so if you start talking to them about smashing their property about before you've even paid for it, taking walls out and extending it, they might start to think, hang on, what if it goes wrong? Does Frank really know what he's doing? What happens if he does half the works and then runs out of money? Or what if it doesn't go to plan and then he never buys the property and I'm left with a house that's been knocked down? What if he sets fire to it whilst I own it and then the insurance doesn't pay out? What if he uses lots of my electricity and gas while I own the property? There's all of these documentation that my solicitor says she's never seen before. This is getting really complicated. I know Frank said this was the best. I know Frank said we'll make more money together, but actually I just want a simple deal. All of those thoughts go through our vendors' minds. And so when you hear a really clever, complicated transaction that's really good for us and really good for the vendor, remember that that's the most complicated we've felt it was worth creating the deal. We often will have other steps that we can do. Often there are additional steps we can do to minimize our vendor's tax situation, but we won't even tell them about them, or we'll mention them but advise them against them, because there's no point having this perfect deal that's really complex that never gets done. If the vendors say, oh yeah, I'd love to pay zero tax, I'd love to pay much less capital gains tax, or I'd love to earn a rental income before I've even sold the property, they might in principle, but when the rubber hits the road, when they're actually looking at all this complicated paperwork and their solicitors, as they have to, are advising them on the potential risks, just to be aware, Frank could go bankrupt while he's doing up your house and you could end up with a half done up house. Just so you know, the tenants may not pay any rent, and then Frank might not buy the house, and then you're left with sitting tenants. Are you a landlord? Do you know how to evict tenants? We need to make you aware of these risks, and they're real risks. Very, 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 very unlikely risks, but they are real risks. And so what we end up doing, and this is the crux of the complexity conundrum, is we look at the most simple deal, we look at the perfect deal that is most efficient for all parties, most profitable for all parties, and then we look at the vendor. If you haven't watched it already, go back and watch the episode on the vendor equation, where we talk about looking at the vendor first, then the property, and then the solution. This is the point where we look at the vendor. Now, the vendor might be quite sophisticated, they might have a large portfolio, they might have really switched on power team, so really switched on legal representation, and have already talked about options, perhaps be familiar with exchange or delayed completion, especially if they've done some commercial investing. They might be familiar with PLOs, for example, purchase lease options, in which case we're already thinking we can take this to quite a complex level so that we can give the vendor great tax mitigation strategies, or perhaps we can do this to maximize their income between exchange and completion, for example. On the other hand, you might have a very high S profile on the DISC profile. We use DISC a lot on EPP, so DISC. A high S profile will be someone who's quite steady in nature, intolerant of risk. They'll be craving security. And so that kind of a profile could be an older person, could be quite a cautious person, a steady Eddie kind of a vendor. We won't even talk to them about some of the complex stuff that we can do on their transaction. We'll keep it nice and simple. Maybe not as the simplest. We might try and take it up a notch or two up the complexity conundrum to give them a little bit of a better deal. But it's our responsibility to gauge that for them. And you might be sat there thinking, well, is that fair, Frank? Is it fair to not tell them every possible solution to their problem? I think it's actually our responsibility to not tell them every possible solution. I think our job is to get to know our vendors, to understand their problems, and then to present them with a very narrow range of solutions that we think suit them best. If we give them 20 solutions, it's going to be overwhelming for the vast majority of vendors. But if we get to know them, get to know their situation, we can present just 2 or 3 potential solutions that we think are going to work best for them, somewhere on that scale. So from simplest to most complex, that's going to be a great win-win. A great win for them and a great win for us. Not the best win for us, that would be up here. Not the best win for them, perhaps. But in terms of their emotions, in terms of their enjoyment, in terms of their peace of mind, in terms of where they're at psychologically, we will pick the best solution for them on the complexity conundrum. And I have seen it far too many times, and it's painful, and it's a disservice to our vendors, quite frankly, where investors have tried to make a deal more complex than the vendor can handle. It's a great deal, and I've looked at it and I thought, that is fantastic, you'll make loads of money, the vendor's getting a really good deal. But it takes too long, it's too complex, the vendor gets cold feet, they pull out because the level of trust isn't there with the investor makes nothing, and the vendor doesn't solve their problem and often ends up in a much worse situation just because the investor was trying to present the vendor with a solution that was too complicated. Guys, if you've enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and that way you'll get an update every single week with tips and tricks that you need to build the portfolio of your dreams that will give you financial freedom and take your property investing to the next level. Until the next episode, happy investing.